Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 5 of Masechta Beitzah. A few notes over here, a few orders of business, is that what they're called? A few things before we begin. Number one, I haven't changed the light bulbs yet. I have light bulbs in my house, but I don't know, it's a whole thing. You gotta get the step stool and change them and everything, so it's a little bit dark in here, but nothing too unmanageable. I also have a coffee dripping, so at some point I'm going to have to go and chop that, because, I don't know, we can always use a little more coffee, right? Right. Now that I've kept you up to date on sort of more of the meta things over here, now let's jump right in. Friends, today we are going to discuss the 2 days of Rosh Hashana. Has that come up at all so far? I think maybe I referenced it, but we've seen a few things so far. We're like going one at a time. First, we start with Beitzah Shenolda b'Yom Tov, right? A Beitzah that's born, an egg that's laid on just a regular old Yom Tov. And then we talked about, well, what happens when this Yom Tov is followed by a Shabbos? What if it's Shabbos followed by Yom Tov? Then we got into Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golius, right? And what about Chutz La'aretz when you have 2 days of Yom Tov? One of them maybe is just a weekday. And okay, we got into that whole thing at the end of the day yesterday. Now we're getting into the 2 days of Rosh Hashana. How do we relate to the 2 days of Rosh Hashana? So that's going to be kind of like I'd say really the main kind of topic of today's daf. So let's kind of jump in. I'll grab my coffee in a minute, or maybe I can grab my coffee now. Friends, one second. Let me just take a look. Okay, yes, Baruch Hashem, my coffee was ready, so I chopped it. Don't worry, this is not my first coffee of the day. I am not jumping into the daf uncaffeinated. This is merely a booster coffee. L'chaim. Alright, let's jump in. So, Daled Amud Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. Idmar Shnei Yom Tovim Shel Rosh Hashana Rav Shmuel Damar Tavai Noda B'Zeh Asur B'Zeh. Friends, what does that mean? Let's read that again. Idmar was stated Shnei Yom Tovim Shel Rosh Hashana. So when it comes to Rosh Hashana specifically, Rav Shmuel Damar Tavai, Rav and Shmuel both agree. Noda B'Zeh Asur B'Zeh, that an egg born on the first day of Rosh Hashana is also on the second day of Rosh Hashana. Now, at the end of the daf yesterday, we discussed what happens on Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golius, right? Because technically speaking, Rosh Hashana is what? The first day of the year, first day of Tishrei. It's 1 day. We keep 2 days. So you would think, okay, this must be no different than why we keep 2 days of Sukkot or Pesach or Shavuos, right? Outside of Eretz Yisrael, we keep 2 days of Yom Tov. There's Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golius. Maybe it's the Sveika Diyoma. That's what we discussed it in the daf yesterday. When we keep 2 days in Chutz La'aretz, is it because, how do we relate to it? Is it that we're not sure which day it is, and therefore we keep 2 days, but 1 day is, necessarily going to be a weekday? Or do we say that it's like one long day? So, it's just like one long Yom Tov. So how do we relate to that? But Rosh Hashanah seems to be different. And we're going to explain why in a minute. When it comes to Rosh Hashanah, it's not about a Sveika Diyoma. Because if we say it's Sveika Diyoma, if we say that, well, we're not sure which day is really the holiday and which day is the weekday, well, then we could say, well, an egg born on the first day, laid on the first day, could be eaten on the second day. Because Memele, one of the days is a weekday, right? Meaning, if the first day was a weekday, so it's an egg that was laid on a weekday, so I can eat it on Yom Tov on the second day. And if the first day was Yom Tov, so then Memele, the second day is a weekday, so I can eat on the second day. So Memele, any egg that's born on the first day of Yom Tov, if we assume that 2 days of Yom Tov is because of Sveika Diyoma, that 1 day is necessarily a weekday, one of the 2 days is necessarily a weekday, so then Memele, you can eat the egg on the second day. Fine. However, Rav and Shmuel both agree that this is not the case when it comes to Rosh Hashana. That when it comes to Rosh Hashana, the 2 days are not of Sveika Diyoma. They're not because we're not sure which one is the real Yom Tov and which one isn't. It's actually, they're both Mamish Yom Tov, and therefore, an egg laid on the first day of Rosh Hashana may not be eaten on the second day of Rosh Hashana. So again, Hitmar was stated, Shnei Yom Tovim Shel Rosh Hashana, When it comes to the 2 days of Yom Tif of Rosh Hashana, Rav Shmuel Damitarvayu, Rav and Shmuel both say, no the baza asura baza, that an egg laid on the first day of Rosh Hashanah may not be eaten on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, because it's just one long kedusha, and just like you can't eat it on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, you may not eat it until after the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the Tanan. As we learned in the Mishnah Barishona initially, they would accept testimony for the new moon all day on Rosh Hashanah. Now this is super interesting, friends. What does this mean? So it comes up from time to time. Really the main sugya of it is going to be in Masechta Rosh Hashanah, which I believe we're learning next. But basically, the way that the Rosh Chodesh was established, nowadays, things are pretty sort of just like, pre-planned, right? You go to shul on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh. Whoever's in charge over there says, look, Rosh Chodesh is going to be on whatever day or days. Here's when the molad is going to be. This is when the moon is going to, appear on such and such a day, at such and such an hour, in certain chalakim, whatever it is. Everything is known in advance. And we know when Rosh Chodesh is. That's how it works nowadays. But originally, the way that it worked was that it was all based on testimony. How would you know when the first day of the next month is? How would you know if the current month has 29 days in it or 30 days in it? That was all up to witnesses. People would look up in the sky and realize, it is, the new moon has been spotted. They would come to Yerushalayim, testify that they witnessed the emergence of the new moon, and there would be all sorts of interrogations and questions. And if it was determined that these people, in fact, noticed the new moon, so then Mimele, that day that they noticed this moon, would be the first day of the next month. Okay, fine. Then they would have to spread the word somehow. Now, friends, if you think about it, there's an extremely interesting nafkamine when it comes to Rosh Hashana. Extremely interesting. Because Rosh Hashana is the first day of the month. And it's a Yom Tov, which means you're not allowed to do malacha or anything like that. So listen to this, friends. So when it comes to the day 30 of Elul, day 30 of Elul could already be the first day of Tishrei, right? Meaning if Elul was a short Elul, was a Chodesh Chaser, so then Elul would have 29 days, which means that day 30 is already day 1 of Tishrei. Now, we're not really going to know this, though, until the witnesses show up on day 30. If the next day on day 30, witnesses show up at some point on day 30 and say, hey, we noticed that there's a new moon. Well, at that point, Mimele, the Bezdin says, Mekudesh. Okay, it's Rosh Chodesh, which means that today, day 30, is now day 1 of Tishrei, and it's Rosh Hashana. But we don't know this, and this is the key point. We don't know this until the witnesses show up, which means what happens? We, of course, the first night of Rosh Hashanah, we go to shul or whatever it is, it's Yom Tif. Now, the interesting thing is, comes the night of the 30th day of Elul, and we're in limbo. Witnesses haven't yet come to testify that they saw a new moon. They haven't seen it yet. But at the same time, they might show up at some point the next day in Bezdin and say we saw the new moon, which means that retroactively, today was already the first day of, it becomes clear that today is the first day of Tishrei, in which case it's Rosh Hashanah. So basically, comes the first night of Rosh Hashanah on day 30 of Elul, and just in case you basically don't do any malacha, you treat it as if it is Rosh Hashanah, but you don't actually know until witnesses do or do not show up the next day. And therefore, if witnesses at some point on day 30 show up in Bezdin and say, hey, we saw the new moon, so then they say, okay, Mekudesh, today is the first day of Tishrei, today is in fact Rosh Hashanah, and then they keep Rosh Hashanah for the duration of the day until it's over, and then the next day is day 2 of Tishrei, it's not Rosh Hashanah. And if no witnesses show up at all on day 30 to say that they noticed the new moon, so then Mimele day 30 was really just that. It was really just day 30 of Elul. And Mimele the next day is going to be the first day of Tishrei. And the next day will be the first day of Tishrei, will actually be Rosh Hashana, but technically speaking, you didn't do any malacha on the first day either, because you never knew the whole time. You were kind of in limbo if witnesses were going to show up in the Bezdin, and it would become clear that that day was actually Rosh Hashana, and if that day was in fact Rosh Hashana, then you didn't want to be doing any malacha. So so it's actually very interesting how sort of the whole witnesses testifying about the new moon thing plays out when it comes to Rosh Hashana, which is the first day of the month, because it's like a funny kind of catch-22, because on the one hand, you don't yet know if today is Rosh Hashana because witnesses haven't showed up. So therefore you have to kind of like not do any malacha just in case it's Rosh Hashana. If witnesses never show up, so then I guess technically it wasn't Rosh Hashana. So it's kind of like a funny place to be in when it comes to Rosh Hashana. So now, with that sort of lengthy intro, but it's just very, it's like very technical, this kind of stuff. So, again, we're still on Dalet Amud Beis. So the Tanan that we learned in the Mishnah, so now initially, they would receive testimony about seeing the new moon all day on the 30th day of Elul. The 30th day of Elul, they would sort of refrain from doing malacha just in case it turns out to be Rosh Hashana, just in case it turns out to be the first day of Tishrei. And Beis Din would be waiting there. They would wait all day. Their doors were open in case witnesses would come to say that they witnessed the new moon. And if at any point during the day, whether it was at 9 in the morning, noon, 1 in the afternoon, 2 in the afternoon, 5 in the afternoon, whenever it was, if at any point throughout the day witnesses showed up and their testimony was accepted, we would say, okay, Mekudesh, apparently day 30 of Elul was actually day 1 of Tishrei, and that's it. And they make that Rosh Hashana. But one time what happened was, the witnesses only showed up after the Korban Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim. Mamish. The entire day, witnesses didn't show up. And as long as witnesses didn't show up, you have to treat the day as if it's the 30th day of Elul, not the first day of Tishrei, not Rosh Hashana. Meaning we're not going to be doing any malacha just in case it turns out to be Rosh Hashana. But in terms of the Leviim, the Kohanim, they brought the Korban Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim, assuming it was just a regular weekday. The Leviim, when they sang the Shir Shel Yom for the Korban Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim, because of course, as we learned in Pesachim and Perek Tamid Nishchat, the Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim was sort of slaughtered in the eighth and a half hour, and then offered on the 9th and a half hour. I don't know, maybe on Yom Tov it was a little different, I can't remember, but, it wasn't, the Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim was offered already before the end of the day, in the afternoon. So that year, they had already offered the Korban Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim, assuming it was just a regular old weekday. They sang the Shir Shel Yom of a regular weekday, and only afterwards, after the Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim, that was offered as if it was just the 30th day of Elul, witnesses showed up and say, no, we saw the new moon, it's Taka Rosh Hashana today. And therefore it was a shtickle messed up, because the witnesses we only found out retroactively that today was Rosh Hashana at the very end of the day. So the Chacham said, you know what, this is nuts. And they made a takana. Sheloyu mekablan asa'edim ela ara mincha. That they would only accept testimony until mincha time. That the cutoff for receiving testimony about the new moon to establish that day as Rosh Hashana was up until the mincha time, up until Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim. So that at least, we know before the Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim that today is Rosh Hashana, and that they would, sing the proper Shir Shel Yom, and they would do it properly for Rosh Hashana. Once, and if the witnesses come after the Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim, Noagin Osayom Kodesh L'Marcha Kodesh, and this is the key. And if witnesses come after the Korban Tamid Shel Beinu Arboim has already been offered, well then what happens is, on the one hand, today is Rosh Hashana, right? Witnesses are coming and saying that they witnessed the new moon. On the other hand, right, so therefore we don't just want to make it, a weekday because they saw the new moon. But at the same time, the Levim already, right, the Kohanim and the Levim, they already did the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, and we don't want to say, okay, today is Rosh Hashana, and then tomorrow is already the second day of Tishrei, and, we kind of like didn't know the entire day that it was Rosh Hashana until the very end. So what they do is, it's not a Sveika Diyoma. It's not like we don't know which day is which. No, we know that the new moon was on day 30 of Elul, was really day 1 of Tishrei. Like, we know that. Witnesses came and testified, right, and with testimony. So, on the one hand, it's not like we don't know which day is which. We know that the witnesses came on day 1, but at the same time, because they came so late in the day, the Beis Din doesn't want to accept their testimony and establish it as Rosh Hashanah, because it's so late in the day, so they say, basically both days are Rosh Hashanah. He said, look, we're going to establish tomorrow as Rosh Hashanah because, you guys only came so late in the day, but at the same time, we're not just going to say, okay, so today's the 30th day of Elul, everyone go and buy pizza. We're not going to say that either. Rather, what they say is, both days are going to be Rosh Hashanah. That in the event that witnesses only show up after the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim was offered, then mamish, both days are going to be Rosh Hashanah. If they show up before the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim is offered and their testimony is accepted, so then that day is Rosh Hashanah. And the next day is just a regular weekday. If they don't show up at all on day 30 of Elul, so Memela, that's exactly what it was. It was day 30 of Elul, and the next day is going to be the first day of Tishrei, it's going to be Rosh Hashanah. But if they show up after the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim has already been offered as a weekday offering, and then they show up and say, wait, we saw the new moon, so in that case the Chacham say, you know what? Both days are going to be Rosh Hashanah. And it's not a Sveika Diyom, it's not we don't know what's what, we know everything. And we're saying, we as the rabbis, as the Chacham are saying, that this year there's 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, it's like one long Kedusha. And therefore, because there could be this situation when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, that you mamish have 2 days that are really Yom Tiv, not a Sveika Diyoma, they're really Yom Tiv. So because of that, we relate to Rosh Hashanah as 2 days of real bona fide Yom Tiv. And therefore, say Rav and Shmuel, that if you have an egg that's born on day 1, that's laid on day 1, it may not be eaten on day 2, since we have to view both day 1 and day 2 of Rosh Hashanah like one long Yom Tiv, not like a Sveika Diyoma. Wow. Okay. I don't think I need to read that again. I think the explanation was kind of thorough, which is, so basically when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, unlike other Yom Tovim, that when it comes to, let's say, Pesach, comes the 15th of Nisan, we keep 2 days of Yom Tov because the witnesses haven't arrived yet and we don't know which one's the first day. That's not the case by Rosh Hashanah. The reason why we keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah is because of the situation that sometimes there are really, actually, declared 2 days of real Rosh Hashanah. Omer Rabbi, says Rabbi, Mitakonos ben Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elach, however, from the decree of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai onwards, Beitzah muteres, a egg born, laid on day 1 is allowed on day 2 of Rosh Hashanah. The Tanan is, we learn in the Mishnah, Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, that once the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Hiskin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai made a takoneh, Sheyu Mekablin Edus HaChodesh Kol Hayom, that he reverted it to how it was initially, that they would accept testimony about the new moon all day, even after Mincha, and therefore, Memele, there was no longer a situation where there were mamash can be 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, because even if the witnesses came after the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, still their testimony would be accepted, and that day would be Rosh Hashanah. So there was no longer a situation of mamash 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, and therefore, if there are 2 days, it's going to be Sveika Diyoma, because it's Sveika Diyoma, and therefore, in places where there's 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, it's only because of Sveika Diyoma, and therefore, an egg that was born on day 1 can be eaten on day 2, Memele. Amalei Abaye. Abaye says to Rabbi, Rav Shmuel Damar Tavayu Beitzah Asur. But 1 second, didn't Rav and Shmuel both say that an egg born on day 1 is Asur on day 2? Amalei Amino Lachana Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai v'Atamar Rav Shmuel. To which Rabbi responds, Abaye. Pashut showed him the head exploding emoji on a WhatsApp message. or whatever means they used to share head exploding emoji. He says, Abaye, I'm telling you, I'm quoting to you a Mishnah from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Tana, the father of all Tanoim. And you're responding, but Rav and Shmuel, Amoraim, granted very early Amoraim, but Amoraim nonetheless, say that you're not allowed to eat an egg that was laid on day 1 of Rosh Hashana. I'm quoting you a Mishnah to say that you are allowed to eat it on day 2 of Rosh Hashana, and you're saying Rav and Shmuel say you're not. So what do Rav and Shmuel do with the fact that apparently Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that we now accept testimony even after the Talmud Shabbat Arbaim? Lo kasha alam valu. To which the Gemara says, it depends. Depends if it's in Eretz Yisrael or in Chutz La'aretz, which is interesting. It's kind of, to me at least, not super clear how to understand this, but Rashi explains that what it means is that in Chutz La'aretz, they kind of always kept 2 days of Yom Tif for Rosh Hashanah. They never had 1 day of Yom Tif. And Kilu, since originally, when they had 2 days of Yom Tif for Rosh Hashanah, it was because of the initial Gezerah that they made, the Takana that they made, that they would no longer accept testimony after the Talmud Shabbat Arbaim. And therefore, there was mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, and since initially the 2 day, the sort of motivation for 2 days of Rosh Hashanah came from the fact that sometimes it would mamish be 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, and in Chutz La'aretz they sort of kept that tradition of always having 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, so therefore it maintains sort of the initial motivation of 2 real days of Rosh Hashanah, and therefore Rav and Shmuel say that in Chutz La'aretz we don't eat an egg laid on the first day, we do not eat it on the second day, since the initial motivation for 2 days of Rosh Hashanah was from the fact that they would not accept testimony after the Talmud Shabbat Arbaim. There was mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, Rashi said, I don't know, what does Rashi say in Eretz Yisrael? If in Eretz Yisrael, she'osin yom echad. Mutaris, I don't know, in Eretz Yisrael, where they keep 1 day, or maybe what it means is that where they keep 1 day and therefore they kind of, it's not Sveika Diyoma, and they kind of know which day is which, but then an egg born on day 1 of Rosh Hashanah may be eaten on day 2. So, okay, so based on Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in Eretz Yisrael, an egg born on day 1 of Rosh Hashanah can be eaten on day 2, but in Chutz La'aretz, not so. Alright. Sounds very nice. L'maisa, I don't have so many chickens over here, but my friends do. My friends, the Friedenbergs in Kisalon, they have some chickens. Baruch Hashem, the chickens were spared by the recent fires. I understand not all the chickens in the area were so fortunate. But my friends, they have chickens, and maybe they'll have mamash a Beitzah shenol b'Yom Tov, but the fact of the matter is they'll actually be in Yerushalayim for Yom Tov, so they won't be around to collect the eggs. But I guess technically an egg that will be laid on day 1 of Rosh Hashanah, I guess, according to this, it sounds like maybe they would be able to eat it on day 2. Rav Yosef Amar, and Rav Yosef says, Af mitakanos ben Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elach Beitzah asur. Whereas Rav Yosef says, even after Ben Yochanan ben Zakkai said that once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we can accept testimony about the new moon after the Talmud Shabbat Arbaim has already been offered. Beitzah Asura, that has no implications for our egg. Our egg that is born on the first day of Rosh Hashanah is still going to be prohibited from consumption on day 2 of Rosh Hashanah. My time because the fact that we don't eat eggs from 1 day of Rosh Hashanah to the next is something that's a davar shebeminyan. It was established, it was decided upon in a sort of like a bunch of rabbis decided so. And when you have something that was established by a whole bunch of rabbis, well, you need a whole bunch of other rabbis in order to permit it. Rav Yosef ben Aminallah, and Rav Yosef says, how do I know that when you have something established by a whole bunch of rabbis, you need a whole bunch of other rabbis to permit it? As the pasuk says, and we're going to unpack this on Heyomud Beis in a little bit. We're going to explain exactly what this means. That the pasuk says by Maimon Ar Sinai that the Eibishter says to Moshe, go tell everybody they can go back to their tents. The pasuk also says that when the shofar sounds, or doesn't sound potentially according to Rashi, the people can now go back on the mountain, because during Ma'amad Har Sinai, the people were not allowed to go on the mountain. But after Ma'amad Har Sinai, they were allowed to go back on the mountain. So we're saying that once the shofar sounds, let's say, so they are now allowed to go back on the mountain. Okay, again, we're going to unpack this soon. The Tanan, and we learn in the Mishnah, Kerem Revai. When it comes to Kerem Revai, friends, what's Kerem Revai? Who can tell me that Flam Revav Masechta Brachis? Kerem Revai is that when you have a vineyard, so of course the first 3 years you're not allowed to eat the grapes because they're orla. On year 4, all of the grapes, you bring them to Yerushalayim, just like Meiser Sheni. You bring the grapes to Yerushalayim and you eat them in Yerushalayim on year 4. Ola li Yerushalayim mahalach yom echad l'chotzad. Now, just like Meiser Sheni, that you are allowed to transfer the value onto money and bring the money to Yerushalayim and spend the money dar'in on food. So also the same thing applies to Kerem Revai. You could take the value of the grapes, transfer it to money, and schlep your money to Yerushalayim rather than the grapes. However, the Mishnah says, Ola li Yerushalayim mahalach yom echad l'chotzad, that if you're within 1 day distance of Yerushalayim, well then we want you to bring the grapes themselves to Yerushalayim. Don't just transfer the value onto money and bring the money to Yerushalayim. If you're within a 1 day's journey, we would like you to bring the grapes themselves, not just money. This is what's considered a 1 day journey. Eilas min Adarim, Eilas in the south, Akravos min Adar Tzofin, and Akravos in the north. Lod min Amayriv, Lod to the west, V'yardim min Amizrach, and the Jordan to the east. That's what's considered within 1 day's journey. V'amar Ulan says Ula v'tem Rav Bavachana, Amar B'Yochanan, Matam, k'dei la'ata shukei Yerushalayim bePeres. Ho ho. What's the reason why, if you live within a 1 day journey of Jerusalem, we would like you to bring the fruits and not just money? Well, because when you have people coming to Yerushalayim with their fruits, then the markets of Jerusalem just become filled up with abundance of people bringing their fruits, and it's a very gewaldige thing. So therefore, we want to encourage people, even require them, that if they live within a 1 day journey of Jerusalem, bring your fruits. Don't just bring money, so that will fill up Jerusalem with beautiful fruits and grapes. V'tanya, we learn in the Beitzah, Kerem Revai elo Rabbi Eliezer b'Mizrach Lod. Of course, Rabbi Eliezer was from Lod, and Rabbi Eliezer had a vineyard to the east of Lod, i.e. between Jerusalem and Lod. Beitzah Kfar Tevi, right next to Kfar Tevi. Okay, sounds very nice. Uvikesh la'afkiru la'aniyim. And he wanted to make the vineyard hefker for the poor people, because it was within a 1 day journey of Jerusalem. And we said that if you live within a 1 day journey of Jerusalem, you should bring the grapes with you to Jerusalem. Don't just bring money. And he didn't want to schlep them to Jerusalem. So he said, you know what, let me just make my vineyard hefker, and whoever wants can take the grapes and bring them to Yerushalayim. Amrullah Tamidav, his student said to him, Rebbe, Kfar nimnu alecha chaverecha v'tiru. Your friends already decided that it was permitted. Man chaverecha, who's your friends? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. That would be Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Tama de nimnu, halo nimnu lo. So what do we see? So we see that the reason why Rabbi Eliezer in the end did not have to schlep his grapes to Yerushalayim was because they then came and undid the requirement to bring him to Yerushalayim, right? So meaning, initially a bunch of rabbis said, it sounds like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, I don't know if it was him alone, whatever it is, but he was considered enough to kind of undo the takana. So initially there was a takana that if you live within a 1 day journey of Jerusalem, you should bring all your fruits to Jerusalem and eat them dar'in. But then it says nimnu, what was it? Nimnu v'gamu, nimnu alecha chaverecha b'tiru. That kilu. Then the rabbis went and kind of undid that requirement. So we see that something that was established by rabbis only got undone because rabbis then decided, like, okay, you don't need to do this anymore. Okay. Maiva Omer. So now in that Beitzah, in this Mishnah that we quoted, Beitzah that we quoted, or whatever it is, Rav Yosef gave a whole bunch of reasons. So we saw a few different psukim. One is saying, Shuvu lachem lo aleichem. Another one was, B'mshachayova yalu bahar. We also saw by Karim Ravai, we saw all sorts of proofs. How come we need all of them? So Maiva Omer, what are all these other conditions that we have to learn that Kodavar Shabinin Tzarech Min Nachal Latiru? So Achikam, this is what it means. Michte. Ksiv Hayinochon L'Shloshes Yomim Al Tikshu Elisha. Well, pre-Matan Torah, prior to Matan Torah, the Pasuk had already said, Hayinochon L'Shloshes Yomim Al Tikshu Elisha, that men and women should not cohabitate for 3 days prior to Matan Torah. So Memele, friends, what does that mean? It means that after 3 days, it's allowed. Well then, so why do I then need a pasuk to say that, well, now tell everybody they can go back to their tents, that husbands can sleep with their wives? Why? Memele, I know, it says for 3 days, stay separate. Memele, after 3 days, do whatever you want. So why do I need the pasuk to say, go tell everybody that husbands and wives are permitted to be together now? I know that, memele. So that what God is saying is that in order, if I'm saying that for 3 days, don't be together, so then in order to be allowed to be together, God was being explicit and saying now you're allowed to, because something that was made forbidden, prohibited by a minion, in this case the authority of God, so it then needs the authority of God to once again permit it, and not just through the inference of, well, 3 days are up, it should technically be allowed. No, it needs to be made allowed by the powers that be. And if you're going to argue that maybe no, the point of Shuvulachim lo aleichem is not to teach, doesn't teach us that kol davar sheb'minyan tzarech minyan acher latiro. Maybe it's just saying that not only are men and women allowed to be together after the 3-day separation, which expired after 3 days, but not only that, God was saying that, no, I actually want the men and the women to be with each other because of the mitzvah of Ona that we learn about Masechta Ksubis Mistameh, about sort of the requirement for men and women to sleep together, husbands and wives to be together. So maybe it wasn't just saying that maybe God was saying that now that 3 days are over, Davka, I want the husbands and wives to be together because of the mitzvah of Ona. Tashma, come in here. Well, that's why we have another pasuk which says that when the shofar sounds, now you're allowed back on the mountain. The pasuk already said that you're not allowed, that the sheep and the cattle are not allowed to graze on that mountain. And ahu means bavayoso, that when God is on the mountain, they're not allowed to be on the mountain. However, memele, when God is no longer on the mountain, then they are allowed to go on the mountain. So why do I need then the pasuk to say that when the shofar sounds, then you're allowed to go on the mountain? What do I need that for? I already know, as long as God is on the mountain, animals are not allowed to graze. Once God is no longer on the mountain, they are allowed to graze. So why do I need the additional shofar blast? So So we see that because it's not just that sort of this requirement expires when God's no longer on the mountain, but it's that, well, if God said that you're not allowed to go on the mountain, it's God himself who has to give the instruction of when you're allowed back on the mountain, because kol davar sheminyan tzarech minyan acher la'atiro. And if you're going to say, okay, so maybe this only applies to mitzvahs deoraisa. For example, when God says stay away from the mountain, so then God has to then say when you're allowed to go back to the mountain. But what about by dinim d'Rabbanan? Maybe when it comes to midrabanan things, we don't say this concept of kol davar sheminyan tzarech minyan acher la'atiro. Tashma, come in here, Kerem Revai, that this thing of Kerem Revai, that when it came, that the rabbis had said that if you live within a 1-day journey of Jerusalem, you have to bring your fruits to Jerusalem. And we saw that Dafka Rabbi Eliezer didn't have to schlep his fruits to Jerusalem because we said that the rabbis Dafka then went and undid that requirement. And when it comes to Kerem Rivai, that this requirement to bring the fruits to Jerusalem if you're within 1 day journey was only midrabanan, and yet we required the other rabbis to come and undo that. So v'chitema Beitzah nami amnu Allah Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai b'shayua. And if you're going to say that, okay, so then the same thing applies to the egg, that just like the rabbi said that, just like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash that they're now going to accept testimony about Rosh Chodesh even after the Talmud Shobin Arabayim on Rosh Hashana, which would then sound like Memele, the egg born on the first day of Rosh Hashana should be allowed to be eaten on the second day of Rosh Hashana. So v'chtema Beitzah nami amnu Allah Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai v'shayu. And if you're going to say, so just like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that we now accept testimony after the Talmud Shobin Arabayim on the first day of Rosh Hashana, or on Rosh Hashana, on the 30th day of Elul, so now also Memele, an egg born on the first day of Rosh Hashana is allowed on the second day of Rosh Hashana. Ki amnu edus abeitzah lo amnu. That when they said that, when they got together and undid the initial decree, the initial gzera of not to accept testimony after the Talmud Shobin Arabayim on Rosh Hashana on the 30th day of Elul, that was only with regard to Talmud Shobin Arabayim. It has no bearings for the egg. An egg that was born on the first day of Rosh Hashana is not allowed on the second day of Rosh Hashana. Amar le Abaye to Beitzah b'minyan mi'avoy. Beitzah be'edus tal yemilsa. To which Abaye says, what? This, nobody ever got together and said that an egg born on the first day of Rosh Hashana is not allowed to be eaten on the second day of Rosh Hashana. No, what they said was that we're no longer going to accept testimony after the Talmud Shobin Arabayim on the first day of on the 30th day of Elul, which then Memele meant that there's mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashana, not because of Sfeikat Yoma, but because the rabbi said there's going to be 2 days of Rosh Hashana, which therefore means that an egg born on the first day may not be eaten on the second day. But nobody ever sat down and said, okay, we're going to say from now on an egg born on the first day of Rosh Hashana cannot be eaten on the second day of Rosh Hashana. That never happened. What did happen was that they said that we're no longer accepting testimony after the Korban Talmud Shobin Arabayim on the day 30 of Elul, which then Memele meant that there's mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashana, and therefore an egg born on the first one, on the first day, cannot be eaten on the second day. But if that were to go away, well then also the Memele, the egg thing goes away. The egg thing was never decided on its own. It was only decided relative to the testimony, to the status of the testimony, and subsequently to the status of Rosh Hashana. Itzer Edus, Itzer Beya. Ishtri Edus, Ishtri Beya. If you're not allowed to accept testimony after the Talmud Shobin Arabayim on the 30th day of Elul, so then Memele there's 2 days of Rosh Hashana mamish, and therefore you're not allowed to eat an egg from day 1 to day 2. But if we accept testimony after Talmud Shobin Arabayim is accepted, is offered, which means that we'll know there'll only ever be really 1 day of Rosh Hashana, in which case an egg born on day 1 is permitted on day 2. Kilu, if we know exactly which day is Rosh Hashana, and in the event that we have 2 days of Rosh Hashana for whatever reason, it's going to be because of Sfeikat Yoma, and an egg born on day 1 is going to be allowed on day 2. So Rav Ada v'Rav Shalman Tarvarim be Kluchis Amru. So the question is, Abai says, I don't understand. Rav Yosef said that even though, the rabbi said that, or Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we now do accept Eidos after the Korban Talmud Shobin Arabayim. Rav Yosef says that has no bearings on the egg, and the egg is still not allowed from day 1 to day 2. Abai says, I don't understand. Shouldn't the egg be entirely dependent on the testimony? And therefore, if we now accept testimony after the Korban Mincha on day 30 of Elul, we should be allowed to eat an egg from one day to the next? So Rav Shalman Tavayim Beit Kluchis Amri. So Rav Ada and Rav Shalman, both from Beit Kluchis, they say, Af mitakanos Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elach Beitzah asura, that even after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says that we now once again accept testimony of the moon after the Korban Tamid Shabin Arbaim, nonetheless, the egg remains forbidden. How come? My time may Yibana Beis Hamikdash. Well, because God willing, the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt speedily in our days. V'yomru, and the people will say, Ishtakid milo achanu beya b'yom tiv sheni. And the people are going to say, well, I remember in years past, an egg that was laid on the first day of Rosh Hashana, we were allowed to consume on the second day of Rosh Hashana. Hashtana minechol. So, let's continue doing that. But they won't realize that, yes, the reason why you were allowed to eat the egg on day 2 of Yom Tiv was because last year they were accepting testimony after the Korban Tamid Shabin Arbaim on day 30 of Elul, which means that Memele, if ever there's 2 days of if we're having 2 days of Rosh Hashana, it's because of it's because of, right, meaning we would know when Rosh Hashana would be, because we accept testimony of the new moon all day on the 30th day of Elul. So therefore, if witnesses come at any point on day 30, that day is Rosh Hashana. If they don't, then the next day is Rosh Hashana. And if we're keeping 2 days, it's because of Sveika Diyoma. Right? It's not because the rabbis are saying that there's going to be 2 days of Rosh Hashana this year. There isn't that anymore. And therefore, right, meaning so in the previous year, when there wasn't the Beis Hamikdash, so we were still based on the Gezer of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we resumed accepting testimony about the new moon after Tamid Shabin Arbaim. So there was no longer this mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah thing. However, once the Beis Hamikdash is going to be rebuilt, they're going to bring back the Takaneh. They're going to bring back the Takaneh. Meaning, of course, during the times of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, there was no Korban Tamid Shabin Arbaim. Sorry if I was saying that. Obviously, there wasn't because there was no Beis Hamikdash, but meaning from the Mincha time and onwards. But now that there's a Beis Hamikdash, they're going to reinstate the Takaneh that we do not accept testimony after the Korban Tamid Shabin Arbaim, which means that there could be a situation where there's mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, in which case you're not going to be allowed to eat an egg from one day to the next. And people are going to make a mistake, because if we allow them to eat an egg from one day of Rosh Hashanah to the next, well then when there's a Beis Hamikdash, they might do the same thing. But when there's a Beis Hamikdash, you wouldn't be allowed to do that, because there could mamish be 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. So, Ihochi edus nami lo nekabel. Well, if that's the case, well then we also shouldn't accept testimony nowadays after, late in the afternoon. Because what will happen? Because my time of Meir Yibana Beis Hamikdash, what happens if next year, right, when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt speedily in our days, and now there's a Beis Hamikdash, v'yomu ishtakim lo kibanu edus hachodesh kol hayom kulo, hashanami nekabel. And then they might make the mistake and say, well, last year we accepted testimony about the new moon all day, so we should continue doing the same thing even now that there's a Beis Hamikdash. So why are we not concerned about that? Right? How come we're saying that nowadays, after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we're allowed to accept testimony about the new moon all day, and we're not concerned, well, what's going to happen when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt? Aren't we going to continue accepting testimony all day, even though we shouldn't be accepting testimony after the Tamid Shabin Arbaim? Because apparently when it comes to the egg, we're concerned about that nowadays you're not allowed to eat an egg from one day to the next, because what happens when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, and you're going to continue eating the eggs from one day to the next, which won't be allowed. Yet, when it comes to Kiddush HaChodesh, we seem to be saying, no, nowadays we can accept testimony all day. What about when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt? We're not going to want to accept testimony anymore. Won't people get confused? So we say that, well, there's a difference. Who's accepting testimony about the new moon? Bezdin. Bezdin, we could trust to kind of know what's up. to know that nowadays they can accept all day. When the Beis Hamikdash is going to be rebuilt, they won't be able to accept the testimony all day. Bezdin we could rely upon to get it right. In egg, like I said, my friends the Friedenbergs and Kisalon have chickens. Chickens make eggs. People eat eggs. Regular, ordinary people. Of course, the Friedenbergs are big Talmidei Chacham. They know all the halachas. But we can't assume that everybody is big Talmidei Chacham. So, therefore, something as widespread as being able to eat an egg, which, is for all of the people. So we have to be a little bit more stringent and say that that nowadays you're not allowed to eat an egg from one day to the next. But something like accepting testimony, we can accept testimony all day nowadays, because when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, it's going to be the Bezdin in charge of the testimony anyways, and they'll know that, not to accept testimony after Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim. Rave Omar says, Rave af mitakonos Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elach Beitzah asura. Says Rave that even after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's takana that nowadays you were allowed to accept testimony all day, still you're not allowed to eat the egg from one day of Yom Tov to the next. Shimbo edim in a mincho l'mayla shnuagin. What? Where am I? Rav Amar ve'elach Beitzah asura. Milo moder Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Doesn't Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai admit Shimbo edim in a mincho l'mayla shnuagin also ayom kodesh l'mocher kodesh? Says Rava, he says, look, interestingly, even Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who says that nowadays we're allowed to accept testimony all day long on the 30th day of Elul, but still, that's only to determine that, if the witnesses come on day 30 of Elul, so the Memela day 30 of Elul was day 1 of Tishrei, and in terms of when we count for like Sukkot, it's going to be from day 30 of Elul, is day 1 of Tishrei, and 14 days later is going to be Sukkot. However, still, if the Eidim come later in the day, in the afternoon, still, we're going to have 2 days of Rosh Hashana, because, like if they come so late in the day, then, we're still going to say, look, keep both days of Rosh Hashana. Keep the next day of Rosh Hashana as well. Just in terms of counting for like Sukkot and important things like that, it's going to be from day 1 when the witnesses came, but since they came so late in the day, we're still going to say keep the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and it's going to mamish be 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, and since it's mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, you're not going to be able to eat an egg from one day to the next, even though we're accepting testimony in the afternoon on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. V'amaravin says Rave hilchsa kavasa dirav b'anei tlas bein l'kula bein l'chumra, and says Rave that the halacha is like Rav as opposed to Rabbi Yochanan when it comes to these 3 halachas about Beitzah. Alright. And we're not going to list what they are right now. But, okay. Friends, that was Daf Hey, Masechta Beitzah. Wow, Masechta Beitzah, man. It's like a real thing, right? Woo. So what did we discuss today? We discussed, really, the 2 days of Yom Tov of Rosh Hashanah. We started off with the statement of Rav and Shmuel, that when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, a Beitzah, that's an egg that's laid on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, may not be eaten on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, because when it comes to Rosh Hashanah specifically, there's mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. It's not a Sveika Diyoma, it's not that we're not sure which day is which. It's that there are situations where mamish, we have 2 full days of Rosh Hashanah, 1 long Kedusha, and therefore an egg that's born on the first day of Rosh Hashanah may not be eaten on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Then we saw an interesting Mishnah that says that after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, however, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that we now accept testimony in the afternoon on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which means that if that's the case, then technically speaking, we don't have this situation anymore where we don't accept testimony from the witnesses who come late in the day on Rosh Hashanah, and therefore we no longer have this situation of establishing 2 full days as Rosh Hashanah. So therefore Rabbah says based on that nowadays, based on Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's takana, an egg that's born on one day of Rosh Hashanah can be eaten on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, because we no longer have a situation where there's mamish 2 days really of Rosh Hashanah. And therefore an egg that's born on day 1 can be eaten on day 2, because the only way to explain why we'd have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah would be because of Sveika Diyoma, just like every other Yom Tov. Therefore, Memela, one of them is a weekday, and you can have an egg from the first day can be eaten on the second day. Rav Yosef says that even after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's takana, still you would not be allowed to eat an egg from day 1 to the next, because not eating an egg from one day to the next was established by the rabbis. It was a davar shebeminyan, And therefore, if it was established by the rabbis, you would need to kind of have the rabbis come and undo that. And while Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai kind of undid the testimony of the witnesses, i.e. that nowadays the witnesses can kind of come back and give testimony, but they never went and kind of undid the fact that an egg is not eaten from one day to the next. To which Abaye asks on Daf Amud Beis, says, wait, but the rabbis really only ever made something based, about the testimony, and then the egg was just based on that, but like they never like actually sat down and said we're not going to allow an egg from one day to the next. To which we had the answer of Rav Ada and Rav Shalman from Beit Kuchlis that the reason why nowadays we don't eat an egg from one day of Rosh Hashana to the next is that, well, the Beis HaMikdash, when it, will be built speedily in our days, and we don't want that people are going to say that, well, last year we would eat an egg from one day to the next, so nowadays also we'll eat an egg from one day to the next. But the difference is that once the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, they're going to reinstate the Gezerah that we don't accept testimony from after Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim is offered, in which case there could be a situation where there's mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, in which case you would not be allowed to eat an egg from one day to the next. So therefore, even nowadays, when we can accept testimony of the month all day, even though nowadays, of course, we don't do it, but technically speaking, testimony can be accepted all day, and therefore we don't ever have 2 full days of Rosh Hashanah. Nonetheless, still we wouldn't eat an egg from one day to the next. Okay, and then we saw the opinion of Ravit, who explains that even Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who says that you can accept testimony all day, that is just to say that, okay, if the witnesses come late in the day, so the Memela today, the 30th day of Elul will be the first day of Tishrei, so that's like when we start counting for Sukkot and things like that. But nonetheless, we still would, if they came so late in the day, we still would keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Okay, friends, well, that was Daf Hey of Masechta Beitzah. I hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy your day. Cheers.